Mixing styles. Now, when it comes to mixing styles, there's regional mixing styles and genre mixing styles. So first, let's talk about regional styles. So there's really three big ones. The first one's LA, Los Angeles, of course, and that's more of a natural and acoustic sounding style. More of kind of the Eagles sound in the 70s and 80s and such. Kind of Santana sort of thing. Okay, then we have the New York style, and that's more of a punchy, compressed, and in-your-face style. There's a specific technique they do with the drums. It's called the New York compressed drums, New York style drums, and it's more of what you have kind of with Toto and some of those other groups that came from the East Coast in the 80s and such. Okay, and then you have the London style, and this is more heavy production, studio effects, and this is more kind of the Beatles and Pink Floyd sort of thing, where they've got all these crazy studio effects going as part of the production, part of the piece. It's not as much about just the performance of specific instruments, but it's how they can be manipulated in the mechanical and electronic realm. Okay, and then there's really an additional one, which is the world kind of style, and the main characteristic of that is heavy reverb on vocals, and it's a lot more reverb on vocals than most American styles put up with. But that's the one way to really kind of help you make your music sound more like the world style or less like the world style, is really dependent on how much reverb you put on the vocals. Okay, and so finally, really all these styles in the last 20 years have kind of, somewhat merged together, because we don't have just engineers working in LA, New York, or London anymore. Now we've got all these independent engineers, freelancers and such, that are all over the place, and maybe they'll do a project that was recorded in LA and done overdubs in New York and mixed in London, or any combination, or other smaller cultures of recording. And so really the styles just kind of all intermingle, and now we've got all these other sub styles and stuff, just depending on who the engineer is and what their influences are, and really now it's going more towards the genres. And so our genre styles, are based on these styles of music, these genres of music, and what kind of traditionally works with recordings of these types of music. So first we got traditional music, or classical music, as most people call it. And this is very acoustic, very dynamic, so it's not going to be compressed really at all. You've got parts that get really loud and parts that get soft. That's part of the performance, those dynamics and such. And so that's got to be maintained in the recording. And lots of natural ambience and reverb. So most of these recordings were done in large spaces where they don't usually add much artificial reverb. They try to get the recording done in a nice large space, but you're going to have a lot of ambience on it usually, depending on the recording. But that's kind of traditional stylistic of traditional music. Okay, then you have folk music. We have prominent vocals, smooth kind of acoustic instruments, nice sounding, warm sounding instruments, and minimal natural sounding percussion. You're not going to have a real heavy driving drum kit in folk. You might have a nice drum kit, but it's going to be a nice smooth sounding kit and have some rich acoustic instrument sound to it. Okay, then we have rock, where the vocals are kind of mixed down with the other instruments, not as prominent in the top, in the forefront. Okay, but you do have prominent raw guitars. That's a big part of rock music, and really punchy drums, a lot punchier than you would in folk or something like that. And so that's really driving, that backbeat is really the heart and soul of rock and roll. And if you don't do that, it's not really a rock and roll song. And so that's some of the stylistic aspects of rock. Now we go to country, which is kind of a mix of folk, rock, and pop, which we'll see in a second. But the big thing is that country has very prominent vocals, probably more than any other genre. And that's because they're trying to tell a story there, and they're trying to display their wonderful vocalist. And so putting those vocals up front is really important. And so if anything kind of fights with that, it's just a big no-no. Okay, so then you got your smooth acoustic instruments, which kind of comes from the folk aspect. You got these nice warm acoustic guitars and such, and pianos, and nice sounding electric guitars and such. And then you've got those punchy drums, which comes from the rock and the pop side of things. So that's kind of what country music is nowadays. And if you want to mix like that, you're going to follow kind of those guidelines. Okay, then we got pop music, which have prominent vocals, not as prominent as country, but rather prominent. Electric sounding instruments, not as much acoustic guitars and acoustic pianos and such, more electronic stuff. Punchy drums and edgy guitars. So we don't have as much raw guitars, but edgy guitars. So we're still driving it, but it's not as raw. It's more rigid and specific about what it's doing. Okay, and then we have hip hop and rap. Prominent vocals, more around the range of where pop music is, not as much as country. And then we have prominent bass, a lot of bass in hip hop and rap music. And keyboard and synthesizer elements are really putting together most of the rhythmic tracks in there. You're not going to have guitars and such as much. And then really a lot of percussive elements. And that's really kind of, if you follow those guidelines, it's going to help you to mix better in those genres, and you can take a listen to these genres and hear how these kind of styles are set up in these different genres, and you can follow those and get your mixes happening the same as the genre. And that is mixing styles.